Related research. Carl Rogers's early research on the three necessary and sufficient conditions for psychological growth can be considered to be a precursor of positive psychology. Since that time, other researchers have found support for Rogers's three facultative conditions. Since Rogers's own research, various aspects of his theory have received some empirical attention, for example, unconditional positive regard and romantic relationships and congruency between self-ideal and real self. Positive regard, self-esteem, and romantic relationships. One of Rogers's key theoretical assumptions was that self-esteem depends on knowledge that one is genuinely understood and unconditionally accepted and loved by an important person in one's life. Additionally, those relationships that facilitate such high self-esteem should be more enjoyable than those relationships that do not provide such benefits. In order to test these predictions, Duncan Kramer conducted a study with mostly female university students currently in a romantic relationship that had averaged a little less than 2 years. 4 self-report measures were administered to each participant: relationship satisfaction, relationship assessment scale, self-esteem scale, Rosenberg, acceptance by partner, modified level of regard scale, and need for approval demand for approval scale, Jones. Results provided some modified support for the predication that need for approval would moderate the relationship between self-esteem and relationship satisfaction. One finding was that the general relationship between self-esteem and satisfaction was significant only for those with high need for approval. The main implication of this finding is that the relationship between self-esteem and being in a satisfying and accepting relationship is complex, and self-esteem is given a bigger boost in a relationship by those who have the highest need for approval. In other words, Rogers's theory also is perhaps in need of a slight qualification. Need for approval is an important dimension in how much our self-esteem will be raised by being accepted and understood by a romantic partner. In another related study on relationship satisfaction, Kramer investigated whether 3 Roge-Ryan facilitative conditions of healthy relationships, empathy, positive regard, and congruence, would be associated with greater satisfaction with the relationship. Moreover, Kramer also predicted that these 3 facilitative conditions would be better predictors of relationship satisfaction than amount of conflict, self-esteem, and demand for approval. Finally, Kramer investigated 2 more complex questions. First, does the amount of conflict change the relationship, moderate it, between the facilitative conditions and relationship satisfaction? Second, do the facilitative conditions change the relationship between conflict and satisfaction? Participants were university students currently in a romantic relationship, average length of time approximately 3 years. The measure of relationship satisfaction was a 7-item relationship assessment scale. Each of the facilitative conditions came from a Roge-Ryan-based measure, a revised relationship inventory. Example items from the congruency scale were: he or she is openly him/herself in our relationship; from the empathy scale, he or she doesn't understand me; from the level of regard scale, he or she really values me; and from the unconditional positive regard scale, I can be openly critical of him/her without it really affecting his/her feelings toward me. Negative conflict was assessed with the 21-item differences of opinion scale, which measured both the frequency and outcome of disagreements. Example items covered topics of conflict avoidance: you try to discuss them with him/her; resentment, you don't feel resentment afterwards; handling evaluation, you don't react negatively to the way they're handled; resolutions, they are resolved for you; and outcome evaluation, you are satisfied with the result. Results showed that each of the 4 facilitative conditions was positively related to relationship satisfaction, whereas conflict was negatively related to satisfaction. Holding each of the other variables constant, only 3 variables explained unique variance over and above the others in relationship satisfaction: level of regard, empathy, and congruence. Although conflict was related to relationship satisfaction, it was not uniquely related, that is, it did not explain any variance over and beyond the facilitative conditions. Once facilitative conditions are held constant, there is no significant association between conflict and relationship satisfaction. Finally, as in the first study by Kramer, there was no significant correlation between self-esteem and relationship satisfaction. Kramer concluded, these findings imply that encouraging or teaching people to be more accepting and understanding of their romantic partner may increase their partner's satisfaction with the relationship more than focusing on how to reduce the negative conflict. Rogers's focus on empathy, positive regard, and congruence as facilitators of happiness seems to garner support from these findings. Self-ideal, congruence, and mental health. Rogers also proposed that the cornerstone of mental health was the congruency between how we really view ourselves and how we ideally would like to be. If these two self-evaluations are congruent, one is relatively adjusted and healthy. If not, one experiences various forms of mental discomfort, such as anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem. In the 1980s, Torrey Higgins developed a version of this theory that has had some influence on current social and personality psychological research. Higgins's version of the theory is called self-discrepancy theory and argues not only for the real self-ideal discrepancy but also for real self-ought self-discrepancy. One difference between Rogers and Higgins is the more specific nature of Higgins's theory. By proposing at least two distinct forms of discrepancy, he predicted distinct negative outcomes from each. For instance, real ideal discrepancy should lead to dejection-related emotions, example depression, sadness, disappointment, whereas real ought discrepancy should lead to agitation-related emotions, example anxiety, fear, threat. Although more specific, Higgins's theory nonetheless has essentially the same structure as Rogers's theory. Individuals with high levels of self-discrepancy are most likely to experience high levels of negative affect in their lives, such as anxiety and depression. Higgins's theory has garnered much empirical attention since the mid-1980s. Some of the recent topics have ranged from alcohol consumption, eating disorders, procrastination, and mental health in general. For instance, Wendy Wolf and Stephen Maisto tested the prediction that higher real ideal self-discrepancy would be related to greater alcohol consumption in a sample of university students. Wolf and Maisto reasoned that people who have large real ideal self-discrepancies look to relieve their negative affective states, anxiety, depression, by turning to alcohol. They went on to reason that this effect should be even stronger on those dimensions of self-concept that are particularly important and salient to the individual. In other words, they believed both the magnitude of the discrepancy and the salience of the discrepancy should be related to alcohol consumption. To test this prediction, Wolf and Maisto studied university students who were moderate drinkers. In an experimental design, they assigned half the students to a high salience condition and the other half to a low salience condition. The first session consisted of participants completing screening measures and completing a real ideal self-discrepancy measure. For the latter, participants rated 35 personality dimensions twice, first, as they really are, and second, as they ideally would like to be. The researchers also evaluated how important each dimension was. The second session primarily consisted of a mood assessment, the salience manipulation, and alcohol consumption. Baseline mood was first assessed by a short questionnaire. Participants in the high salience condition were instructed to think of and list possible reasons for the discrepancies between real and ideal self from the first session. By focusing attention on their discrepancy, this procedure was expected to increase negative self-evaluations and negative mood. Participants in the low salience condition simply completed a filler task during this time by crossing out letters in a document. Mood was again assessed to examine whether those in the high salience condition experience greater negative mood. Finally, alcohol consumption was assessed by having each participant take part in a taste testing session. They were given 3 different carafes of wine and 3 different carafes of seltzer. Next, they were instructed to rate each drink on its palatability on 7 adjective pairs, example weak strong. They were given 30 minutes and informed they could drink as much or as little of each in order to make the evaluations. After controlling for a gender effect, men drank more than women. Results showed no overall effect of discrepancy on wine consumption. There was, however, a positive relationship between discrepancy and amount of wine consumed for the low salient, filler task group. Only the greater the discrepancy, the more wine consumed. For the high salient group, surprisingly, the researchers found a small negative relationship: the greater the discrepancy, the less wine consumed. This last finding was unexpected, and Wolf and Maisto suggested that it may be due to the salience manipulation not performing as predicted. Most importantly, based on evaluation of mood ratings, high salience participants actually showed a decrease in negative mood, anxiety, not an increase as expected. In this sense, their theory was supported: decreasing negative mood should and did lead to less alcohol consumption. They simply did not expect the salience manipulation to decrease negative mood. In general, these results supported Rogers's notion that people whose ideal self is at variance with their real self may turn to alcohol or other unhealthy behaviors as a means of coping with this discrepancy.